Little JTAC and Big Toke don't like how I'm abbreviating their names. They can suck it, dude. What are they gonna do about it? Man, you know what's crazy? Is going to the website here, going to the CPT website, and all I see left is Capcom Cup 2018. I can't believe that's the only thing left. That's wild to think about. There's only Capcom. Look at how many events there's already been this year. First of all, can I just say there's way too many events. You know, you guys are like, it's great. There's just stuff to watch all the time. I'm sure it's very nice to always have stuff to watch, but sometimes I just want a break. I'm just thinking about it, especially with me, right? I work on so many different fighting games. It's very rare for me to have a break anyway. But man, it is fucking rough to go to all these different events. Me asking for less events is like well, it's bad when I'm asking for there to just be less events because it's better for the circuit. I think eventually people get worn down and worn out, right? Because think about it like this. With the way fighting games currently work, there's really not very much downtime in the year, right? Because Evo Japan is now in January, February, and the season starts in March. When you think about it like that, there really is not very much downtime, right? Because if you're training for Evo Japan, you're going to play in January, right, to get ready for it. February is going to be Evo Japan. Then you're going to train in February because in March, the very first CPT events are going to be starting up. So for that reason, people are going to be playing all year long pretty seriously. Combat sports aren't seasonal sports. Sure, but in combat sports, you fight, and then you don't fight in a major fight again for 6 months or 4 months or whatever it is. Because the fighters, first of all, need to recover from the fight. But then you have to restart training and then boot camping for the next fight that you're into. Even in combat sports, you need to have breaks to let your body rest and also your mind rest. Because if you go too crazy, like, you do too much, like you just end up beat up and messed up. And yeah, you need to have breaks. And even if the breaks are like you train, but you don't train as hard and then you study film or whatever it is, like, yeah, you need to take time off. He says that's not how it goes. That's optional. I've done lots of combat sports. I'm familiar with how it works. It's not like people are just fighting every single day, all the time. Like, you have to take breaks in your training. Otherwise, you end up injured or you're just not being safe. Even through the weight cutting, even through everything you have to do. Like, people are fighting all the time. But you have to take reasonable breaks. I mean, especially after a fight. If you get messed up during a fight, you're not going to be fighting again, like, for at least a few days, if not a week, to recover. Because you get the shit kicked out of you sometimes. Most combat sports are like that, particularly because you have to cut weight, right? And then after you're done cutting weight, you fight or you do whatever the combat sport is. So you do weight cutting into the activity, into, like, going again. So yeah, it depends. It depends on how, like, if you have a fight and you knock somebody out in 30 seconds, like, sure. I mean, it's not that bad. Unless you're in an anime tournament arc, yeah, where they just fight 5 people back to back, no problem. Somebody says you don't have to cut weight. All right, well, you did a good job of trying to talk about combat sports, but you made it, and now it's time for you to. You had a good run. I cut lots of weight when I was a wrestler. I think I told that story. There was a time, the most weight I've ever cut, in a day, was for my senior year of high school. If I think I talked about this a lot. So when I was, I love wrestling. I did wrestle for a long, long time. I coached high school wrestling as well. And it's one of my favorite sports, probably my favorite sport, actually, now that I think about it. And the most weight I ever had to cut was my senior year. And what I wrestled the year before was about 170 pounds by the end of the year. Then, the next year, I was wrestling 5 days a week and I was lifting weights 5 days a week, right? So I'd lift weights 5 days a week, and some days I'd lift twice a day, along with doing, like, whatever wrestling or whatever I was doing that day, right? And then I was in the off season. My senior year, I was about like 235 or something like that, right? I was about 235, and I was big. I had my squat was like maybe 460 pounds or 450 pounds or something like that. I had a crazy squat. I had a really high bench. Like, I was like pretty, what's it called? I was pretty strong, but way too big for what I was wrestling. So the first event of the year, I had to wrestle at 195, right? And I was at 230 pounds or so in the off season. So for like a month and a half, I cut 20 pounds, right? It took me a month and a half to cut 20 pounds. Then I was at 206. And the next day I was wrestling 195. So in that day, I cut 11 pounds, right? I had wrestling practice. I went home and had like a banana for dinner. I went running, right? I came back the next day. I didn't eat all day. I cut weight at practice again, wrestling in a sweater, sweatpants on. Like you tape up the sleeves so that it's like you keep the heat inside, right? The wrestling room has the heater on, so it's like 85, 90 degrees in there. Just sweating. You just lose all this weight. 11 pounds from the night before when I weighed in all the way to the next day. Cut all the way down to 195. I was supposed to wrestle somebody else, right? And the guy I wrestled against was the 182 pounder for the other team. He was a state finalist the year before. And he didn't feel like cutting any weight, so he just went up to 195. So you just imagine me. I cut like crazy. I cut like, in a month and a half, I cut 30 pounds, like 35 pounds, right? I cut so much weight, just losing all this weight to try to get down to 195. And then this dude, he's a 180 pounder. He's like, I don't feel like cutting weight. He weighed in at like 190 pounds, state finalist the year before. I'm exhausted. It's the first time I cut weight all year, right? So I'm just destroyed. My body is so beat up. I haven't had water. Like, I just shriveled up. I'm dying, right? So the way wrestling works is, unlike fighting, you weigh in and you wrestle the same day. So I weigh in, I have something to drink. My body is just absolutely demolished. And this kid who didn't cut any weight just goes up. I wrestle him. He beats me. I'm just like, what was I supposed to do? Right? What the hell was I supposed to do, right? Just body is destroyed, dehydrated. But after that, all the weight cuts, not so bad the rest of the year. Because by the time that was over, I was at about 200 pounds. So cutting 5 pounds for a weight cut, no problem. You start like 3 or 4 days early. You get in. And then by the end of the year, I was about 178 pounds or something like that. 180 pounds. It was a bad matchup. It was a bad matchup that day. Yeah, I cut weight down to 180 pounds or so. Now I'm lighter than that. I'm lighter than when I was in high school. I don't have any of the muscle anymore. But that's just what wrestling is like. The weight cutting is so brutal when you're in high school. How tall am I? I'm like 5'10". So I was 5'10", wrestling, and I wrestled about 180 pounds my senior year. When I was in my sophomore and junior year, I wrestled like 160, 170. Weight cutting is always sad. I always think back up to high school because you have to go to school while you're a wrestler, right? Like when you're a fighter, you just fight and cut weight, right? So you don't have other stuff that you have to do to think about. But when you're a wrestler, you have to go to school. So I just think about the days where I was a literal zombie. I hadn't eaten, I had cut a ton of weight, and I'm just like sitting there in class, like I have no energy, right? I'm just like dying. I feel awful. 5'10", 230 is crazy. Yeah. I mean, in the off seasons, I would get big. Like I was lifting 5 days a week. I'd be super muscly, but I'd also be heavy, right? I was like heavy during the summers. I love wrestling. It's fun. It's a very fun sport to teach. I've been thinking about doing it again lately just because I want to work out, and wrestling's such a great workout. And teaching wrestling is really fun. I just have to find a place to do it. And I think the cool thing about, I was just going to bring this up, Sleepwalker brought it up before me. The cool thing about wrestling or many combat sports, I've done a lot of things besides wrestling. I've tried other grappling types. I've tried different striking types and stuff. The thing about wrestling and or any combat sport and fighting games is that you'll notice stylistically they're very similar, and a lot of the thought processes about them are very similar as well. Fighting games and wrestling are the same kind of way. I realized that the way I like to wrestle is very similar to the way I like to play fighting games, right? When I used to be a wrestler, I was very defensive and very solid, but really like textbook in the sense that like I didn't have lots of fancy crazy moves that I could do. Like I had a few good throws, I had a few good comebacks if I had to make it, but generally I was really defensive, solid wrestler, right? That was like the main thing that I liked doing. And in fighting games, I'm very similar. I don't want something super fancy. I just want really solid core, like kind of basic style that's defensive and strong. That's all I care about. Yeah, the Aegis mix-ups, I mean, those are built in. Somebody else taught me how to do it, right? That's how it was. Would I have a 3-frame jab? Probably not. Yeah, good neutral. I had excellent neutral. And I was really good on defense, but just really bad as an offensive wrestler. Says the soul player. Look, every once in a while, you got to get a little rowdy, right? Yeah, I was a very boring wrestler, but very good. When you think about a lot of the strategies and ideals behind combat sports, it's very similar in fighting games. The kinds of The kinds of things that you look for as those are like very similar, right? The way your style works, stylistically, how people match up, the offensive, fighter versus the defensive fencer, the grappler versus the striker, right? That's a common thing in fighting games. This is just a common thing in combat sports too, right? Is there turtling in wrestling? Yeah, there's wrestling defensively. If you have a lead and time's running out, you don't do anything, right? There's no reason to do anything. You just wait. That's the same thing. Yeah, stalling. I never got called for stalling, though. I would stall a lot, but I never got called for it. I was very good at pretending like I was doing something. I would always get a lead in a match and never do anything. That's the strategy. I knew how to leg ride, but I didn't like doing it ever. So in wrestling, there's 3 positions. And I think about fighting games very similar to how I think about wrestling positions. Because in wrestling, there's neutral, where both wrestlers are standing up on their feet, right? I did collegiate wrestling, for those of you guys wondering, that style. But I also know how to do Greco and freestyle. There's 3 positions in wrestling, right? There's neutral, which is both wrestlers are on their feet, and they're trying to find a takedown, which puts you in top-bottom position. I think about that as getting a knockdown in a fighting game. It's very similar in that way, where in wrestling, they have the wrestler who gets top position. They have the advantageous position. That is like a knockdown in a fighting game to run a mix-up. And bottom position is like being the defender, right? That's like the same kind of thing. It's very similar in that sense. Who's the best wrestler I've seen in MMA? Khabib's an excellent wrestler, although the Middle East has lots of countries that are very good at wrestling in general. In particular, historically, on the national scale, Russia is excellent at wrestling. Iran is super good at wrestling. Japan usually has some pretty good wrestlers. The U.S. usually has a couple of people that are good. It's usually not like the U.S. team is like the best team currently, but I feel like every team is like that. I think as a country, usually like Iran is really strong. Japan owns women's. Yeah, in women's wrestling, Japan is usually the strongest country. Bulgaria. Yeah, there's a lot of countries that take wrestling very seriously, where they do it from when they're young. U.S. is usually not the best at wrestling, because the way the U.S. works is that the kind of wrestling you do in the Olympics is different than what they teach in high school and college. So a lot of wrestlers, when they're younger, will do high school wrestling, college wrestling, and then they have to learn to do Olympic-style wrestling while they're still obviously young enough to compete in the Olympics. So you have to learn a new style of wrestling that you've never done the rest of your life to go to the Olympics to wrestle people who have done it their whole lives. So just the rules are very different, right? So that's why the U.S. typically doesn't have as many strong wrestlers, I think, on the national scale. Ukraine, yeah, a lot of those countries. But yeah, that's why U.S. wrestling typically, right, is not the strongest of all the regions. And also in the U.S. in particular, a lot of wrestlers, when they finish with collegiate wrestling, they want to go to the MMA. So I don't want to go do MMA in like the UFC or some other mixed martial arts like company or something, right? So a lot of them don't go to do Olympic wrestling for that reason. Like, who's in the UFC now, who's an Olympic gold medalist for wrestling, is Henry Cejudo. He did like obviously collegiate wrestling and stuff. Or I don't actually know if he did collegiate, now that I think about it. He's a high school wrestler, but he was an Olympic gold medalist in 2008, the Beijing Olympics, whatever that was. And a lot of those guys have, like Mark Munoz was a wrestler. He's in the MMA. There's a lot of guys that did stuff like that. You really want to get into a contact sport or get into some kind of martial arts. If you're young enough, if you're in high school, I recommend wrestling, because most schools don't have like a judo or like a Brazilian jiu-jitsu or something like that. Wrestling is like a sport you can be in. And then if you're interested in other stuff after that, right? If you want to try striking, kickboxing or Muay Thai is great. If you want to try additional stuff that might help you with wrestling, judo would be really good, because it's another, you'll learn a lot of throws. I like judo a lot because I had a lot of good throws and throw defense, so a lot of judo throws are really useful in wrestling. BJJ is great as a sport, but it doesn't really, like, a lot of the skills that you learn in BJJ don't really translate to wrestling, right? A lot of wrestling skills will translate to BJJ, and a lot of the basic grappling knowledge is good, but BJJ, a lot of it fights from your back, which you don't really want to do in wrestling that often. They're kind of contradictory in that sense. I feel like if you learn one first and then you try to learn the other, they'll feel a little different in terms of like what your goals are when you hit the mat. Wouldn't a wrestling body be slow at throwing punches? No, not necessarily at all. Wrestling is a lot about explosiveness, and wrestling matches are short compared to a lot of other sports and stuff. If you think about like a football match or a baseball match or a basketball match or whatever, right? Wrestling matches are 6 minutes at most in high school, right? And collegiate wrestling, they're 8. Yeah. So it's a little different, but in general, wrestling is very short. I mean, even think about the UFC, right? Like, it's much longer than a wrestling match, right? So the most important thing about wrestling is explosiveness and short-term cardio, like explosive cardio and being able to put a lot into a short period of time, right? It's full body sprint is how they talk about it a lot. Khabib's conditioning is great. His wrestling is crazy. I didn't know that much about him. I hadn't seen him fight that much. I had just heard that he was a strong wrestler. And I saw some of the highlights, and I was like, wow, his wrestling looks sharp. And I saw the first low single he did to Conor, and I was like, oh my God, his wrestling is good. It was like immediately obvious how good his base of wrestling is, right? Just from the shot. It was like so clean how he did it. And MMA wrestling is a little different than traditional wrestling, particularly because of the stance you hold and the kinds of shots that you can take, because some are more dangerous than others in MMA. Like for instance, a lot of MMA fighters, particularly against the cage, like outside singles, because they can bury their head and you can't hit the back of the head. So doing a low single is great, or an outside single is great, because you go on the outside leg and then you bury your head in low so that they can't hit you on the top or the back of the head, right? So it's a pretty safe shot to take, because you sort of force your opponent to grapple with you and not swing at you, right? So in MMA, a lot of people take singles, outside singles or low singles, because they tend to be safest and you can duck your head and you can't hit on the back of the head in MMA. Well, in the UFC in particular. Other types of shots are a little more risky to take depending on the position, the striker, and like what they're good at. If they have good knees and you try to take like a low single and they knee you in the face, well, then you might be in trouble. This low single that he took it was good. When I saw it, I was like, oh man, Conor, you're fucked, bro. I knew it immediately. I was like, oh, if that low single is going to be like the key shot, like, oh no. Like, that low single was brutal. And I don't blame Conor for not defending it, because he changed levels and just got the angle so quick.